Well, delighted to be with everybody today. The reason that we wanted to put this together today is because Toby and I are really good friends. We've worked with each other for years and years. He comes at things from a kind of diversity and inclusion lens that I've learned a lot from. I come at things with an accessibility lens, and he's learned a lot from that. And we really appreciate each other's contributions and differences. But what I find is with a lot of organizations, the people doing accessibility and the people doing diversity and inclusion never actually talk to each other. They never actually realize that if they came together, they could actually help each other to do amazing things. So that's what we're about today. We're looking at, if you like, some of those blind spots in organizations. In my world, in accessibility, I think one of the blind spots is focusing on customers all of the time and forgetting that staff may have disabilities too. What I've encountered in terms of maybe the D&I blind spots is that they do want to include people with disabilities, but reasonable adjustments is almost as far as it goes. Actually, accessibility of things like tools is kind of missed. So we're going to be exploring today, bouncing backwards and forwards between the things that we've learned from each other and how these things have enriched what we do, each of us, and how together we can build a cohesive inclusion strategy. So I'm Jonathan Hassell. I'm CEO of Hassell Inclusion. I've been doing this accessibility thing for around about 22 years now. No more of me. Toby, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hey everyone, lovely to see you today. Thanks for joining Jonathan and I. As Jonathan said, we've been working together for a very long time. So Jonathan actually recruited me when I was at the BBC working in accessibility. So I was his project manager. And then Jonathan left the BBC to set up Hassell Inclusion. And I left to set up my company, but we've worked together, partnered. Obviously, Jonathan's focus on digital accessibility and my focus on creating inclusive workplaces go perfectly hand in hand.
Great stuff. So brilliant. So how you're going to experience things today is there are three things that Toby's going to share that he learned from me, and I'm going to share three things that I learned from Toby, and then there's a little bit of a conversation between us as we sort of swap backwards and forwards between the two. So Toby, yeah, let's take it away. What did you learn from me?
Yeah, so when we first worked together, Jonathan, we were both at the BBC, and initially, I think my view on accessibility was quite narrow and limited. I thought it was about making sure that videos on iPlayer had subtitles for people who were, say, visually impaired, who had hearing impairments, or it was about making sure that somebody who had a mobility impairment could navigate around the news website using the tab key on the keyboard. But actually, accessibility is so much broader than that, and it encompasses so many more people. So one thing I learned from you, and I think it's on the next slide, Jonathan, is that there's kind of different types of impairment. So there are people who've got a permanent impairment like myself. I was born with a genetic neuromuscular disability, and so I can't lift my arms. So I use Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is speech to text software, for instance, to be able to use my computer and do my work. But then there are individuals who kind of have progressive impairments that might come with, say, aging. Then there's people who are temporarily impaired. So I've worked with colleagues who went on holiday skiing and broke their arm and then came back to the office and then for a few weeks had real difficulty writing emails because they were trying to write their emails one-handed. And there I was babbling away at my computer with Dragon Naturally Speaking, and they were really jealous of me because they hadn't even come across that kind of technology before. But then the one that I find quite interesting is those who are situationally impaired. So you might be a parent holding a child in one hand and trying to cook with the other and read a recipe on your iPad at the same time. Or you might be working in an environment which has got very bright lights and a lot of glare on the screen. So you're effectively visually impaired at that time. And I think a great example is your mum and some of the difficulties that she has had accessing digital technology that come with age. So, maybe her, because her eyesight is deteriorating, but also particularly over the last 2 years or so, we've seen an acceleration of people going online to do transactions. So I remember when we were doing webinars a couple of years ago, Jonathan, when you were talking about the difficulties that your mum was having doing her online shopping. And I think she was on the phone to like Tesco's customer services department for like 2 hours to try and get her shopping cart put through because she was having difficulty with shopping independently online. But so much more is going online, banking, also things like making your appointments for your COVID vaccines, that kind of thing, medical notes going online. And unless we make those platforms accessible, more and more people are going to have difficulty accessing those services. And the other thing, Jonathan, is I think a lot of people think that accessibility is just about like the website, or the app, or the internal tools that we're using, like an intranet, for example. But actually, we need to be thinking about the whole entire journey. And I mean, this is something I touch on in my book, where I talk about colleague experience and design, rather than trying to kind of fix individuals, thinking about the journeys that employees go on and making those journeys accessible. In other words, removing any speed humps or roadblocks that prevent people from completing a journey, like recruitment would be a journey, for example, putting in your application and going for interviews and such like. So we need to think about the whole journey. And if we think about over the last couple of years, kind of the pandemic journey that people have been going on, how accessible has the information been end to end? So, has the Prime Minister's announcements come with subtitles? Initially, they didn't. And there was a real push to make sure that his announcements were getting captioned and subtitled properly, all the way through to, how accessible is the app to book your jab? How accessible is the information when you show up to the center to get your jab, or the form that you have to fill out when you get there to make sure you don't have any allergies? All of that whole entire journey has to be accessible.
Of course. Thanks, Toby. So one of the things we wanted to kind of challenge each other in these things. So obviously accessibility is definitely for people who have a disability and for people who are older, but there are loads of different, if you like, protected characteristics. So people in the accessibility world won't have seen a slide like this before, and they won't be looking, if you like, beyond disability into all of the other protected characteristics which are there in D&I. Do you think that accessibility can kind of help any of the other groups that D&I people spend their time thinking about?
Definitely. So, for example, when we talk about accessibility, we often think about disabled people, which is just one of those circles on the diagram. But we've also mentioned, disability that comes with age. For example, your mum, Jonathan, and the difficulties that she's had accessing it. But we also have to think about accessibility in terms of the other groups. So, I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day about menopause and about the brain fog that she has experienced or is experienced, and again, when she sat down at work, how accessible are things with that brain fog? When we look at things like even like, ethnicity and race, if you've got a careers portal, for example, are you showing a variety of images that actually demonstrate the diversity of people working in your business, so that people can see themselves reflected in your organization and may be more compelled to apply? When we look at things like sex and gender, when you ask people for their gender, are you giving them like a full set of genders that you can pick from? Are you giving people the ability to almost like have a free text field if they don't identify with man, woman, or non-binary, for instance? So these are all of the things that we need to think about when we're making our digital tools accessible and inclusive.
Great stuff. Thanks, Toby. So over to me. So I'm going to say, this is one of the things that that I really learned from Toby, is that accessibility is as much about your staff as it is for your customers. And as Toby already mentioned, actually, I think Toby was the first member of staff that I ever line managed who had a disability. And that was really, really helpful for me, because my job at the BBC was to think about the accessibility needs of the customers, so the people who are using iPlayer, that sort of thing. I had a different person in the BBC who was there looking at staff accessibility. But because there was that split, it was almost like staff accessibility didn't sort of like figure in my thinking. And that was a real sort of potential problem. And Toby really kind of grounded things for me. You know, the business cases are strong for the importance of disabled staff to your organization as it is to the importance of disabled customers. We're going to go into, if you like, the business cases of all of that in a little while. But it is really, I think, frustrating to me that a lot of organizations think accessibility is just for their website because they want to sell stuff to customers. And it takes them a long time to realize that it's for their staff as well. As I say, I learned it from Toby, and the key thing really that I wanted to sort of call out for anybody on the call who kind of is in that role of accessibility is that most of the time when you're thinking about accessibility for staff, it's actually about the accessibility of tools, you know, the things that you use every day, like Office 365 or whatever, or your timesheet system, which is also in a browser. All of those different tools need to be as accessible as your website. And, you know, thankfully, some of those vendors are really starting to come on this journey. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of some good news about what's happening in that sort of space, because for ages, the problem was this, that if tool vendors were asked about the accessibility of their tools before an organization purchased them, they would say, is your tool accessible, yes or no? And anybody who works in accessibility knows that that's not a reliable question. Actually, you know, parts might be, parts not, for whom? And so the good news is that some organizations are going with us on really great journeys to understand how to do this better, to go from, if you like, accessibility not being asked of tools, not in procurement, to that kind of yes, no sort of question, you know, give us your VPAT and then maybe we'll buy your tool, because at least we know we've done something about accessibility for our staff, all the way through to things like, okay, actually our staff are going to be using your tool, so we're going to test it with our disabled staff to see if they like it, and if they do, we'll use it. Can you prove that you'll keep it accessible is the next thing, which is something we thought about a lot when we were doing the international standard that I created. And then one of our clients is actually using us to train their vendors these days, because their vendors are taking a long time to get there. All of this sort of stuff is actually, we did a really great poster. So if you pop onto our website, you can find that poster on there in the insights section, and say there's lots of good stuff there. So yeah, that's my perspective, Toby.
Yeah, and I think so one thing that I picked up when we worked together in Hassell Inclusion was that we were having loads of great conversations with people, and often they would say, but if we want to do really well on accessibility, isn't it an expensive thing to do? You know, what is the cost? We've got so many other priorities in the business, you know, other business as usual things that we have to get done, like, you know, and some clients that we were talking to were going through big transformation projects as well. So it was just like another thing that they had to think about. So what are your thoughts on the kind of the expense of accessibility?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I would look at things is expense is not a reason to not do something. You know, we all do expensive things all of the time. We do them if they're worth doing. And so, you know, we're going to come on to a business case thing. But if you like, part of the reason why this sort of stuff is actually starting to move is that a lot of the government procurement standards are now really starting to bite. So you can't sell your tool into a government agency in most countries these days unless you can prove that it's doing the right thing with accessibility. So if you like, that sort of thing, I think is changing the goalposts really, which is a great thing. But it really does come down to your next point, Toby, which is, you know, there is a business case for accessibility. So yeah, why should people do this, and what can they benefit?
Well, I mean, one thing that I learned from you, Jonathan, is that there is a good business case. And when we were both at the BBC, I think I felt almost like spoiled that we didn't really even have to think about what the business case was, because the BBC is a public service broadcaster. It has to be accessible. It's consumed by the whole of the UK, and there is a royal charter that we have to abide by as well. But then when I went and rejoined the corporate sector, worked for Deloitte for a couple of years after the Beeb, that's where my corporate hat came on, and it was like, okay, so what is the business case? And I like how you actually very simply put that there is a financial case. Simply put, if more people can do more transactions online, they can spend more money with your business. If you've got people who are having to ring up your call center or go into your branch because they can't do what they want to do online, like apply for a mortgage, for example, then that introduces additional cost, because it's cheaper to service people online than it is, face to face in a branch or through a call center. There's an ethical thing as well, and this one's a big one for me, because so many organizations say on their careers websites that they are a diverse and inclusive organization, but then they don't have an accessible careers website or app or things like that. And so they're just not being congruent with what they're telling the world about when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So they really have to walk the talk. I mean, of course, I think the one that most people think about is the legal implications. Particularly, I think, obviously things are different over in the States compared to the UK. But if your site is not accessible, then you are at risk of facing legal action. And I know you can talk more about the differences sort of between legislation in the UK and the US. But the one that I get excited about, and I think you get excited about as well, Jonathan, is the innovation. And there's been so many things that have been developed for disabled consumers in mind that have entered the mainstream. So the keyboard was designed for a blind countess in Italy, I think it was, to write love letters to her lover. And now we all use keyboards. I use the Amazon Echo devices all the time to control my environment, because I can't lift my hands up. And I remember that when you were working at the BBC, you were working on a project to teach children with visual impairments mathematics, and that technology was then picked up by a gaming company for a game that they were designing where you had to run away from zombies. Yeah, you had to run away from zombies, but of course you can't look at your phone while you're running. So they were using 3D sound and audio that you had developed through that project. So there's a huge amount of innovation to be had. And this is something that we talked about on a recent podcast, wasn't it? So if anyone's interested, they can listen to Yak and me and Jonathan talking on the podcast, which is on the screen. And it's probably in HiHub, I imagine.
No, it's actually on the main part of the website. I would seriously encourage people to go to that. In about sort of half an hour, we kind of pick through how accessibility can really help. And I'm still pointing people to this video all of the time. So, so here's the thing then, Toby, okay, there's loads of benefits there. So it sometimes feels like D&I don't prioritize disability or accessibility. If there are benefits there, why is it always at the back of the queue?
Two reasons. One, a lot of the time it gets put into the too hard category. And so it just gets avoided, to be honest with you. I think, plain and simple as that, really. The other thing is, I think that the people are not feeling the kind of the pressure or the pain enough. And it's so easy to kind of brush off. So, from a personal story, I'll share this very briefly. I'm with a particular bank. I've got an appointment on Friday because I'm moving from this bank to another bank because the online banking app is not accessible for me. And I actually reached out to the head of accessibility, sorry, not the head of D&I, because obviously I'm in the D&I world, and said, thought you might like to know that actually I'm switching banks because, it's not accessible. And I got the brush off. And I was like, well, if the bank is not really concerned about making sure that I can use their services, then I don't want to be a customer of that bank. And so I'm going to go to another bank, which I know is more accessible.
That's awful that in this day and age you had that experience, Toby. But yeah, the right way of dealing with that is to go somewhere that does care. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we see this back of the queue type thing for ages, and it is hard. So I wanted to look at why it is for accessibility people that if you go and chat to a D&I person, you might feel like you were coming across speaking a completely different language. Why is it hard for them to prioritize disability? Again, here's the thing. It's one of these protected characteristics. So, every year people go, oh, well, let's pick that one and see if we can do something good there. It's difficult to do everything all at the same time. So sometimes, if you like, disability is at the back of that queue. Now, that's not okay, but it is a reason for it. So if you are approaching a D&I person, expecting them to really understand what accessibility is when they're focusing on issues for people of another protected characteristic at the moment, you may be disappointed that they're not sort of, if you like, wanted to talk to you because they're thinking about a different group. That's one of those things that happens. But I think the reason, certainly from my perspective, is that disability, like all of those other characteristics, has a number of challenges for inclusion in it, but it also has extra challenges, especially technical ones, that I think makes it really hard. So, for example, the challenges for inclusion for people in general who are in one of those protected characteristics are things like what Toby was saying earlier, portrayal in communications. Can you see somebody like yourself on a website, that sort of thing. Unconscious bias in interviews. Toby could tell you a lot about that. I'm not going to try. I'm just going to point you to his book because it's awesome. But in work, a lot of the use of language, the wrong use of language, the hurtful use of language, often unintentionally, can be one of those things that happens. Microaggressions and discrimination, glass ceilings that people experience because, if you like, there is discrimination and they can't get to where they would naturally be in terms of progression in the organization. You also have things which are kind of more technical, like, for example, complexities of gender when it comes to toilets. But in general, most of it is about how people behave. It's not about technical stuff. If you come across, if you like, into disability, there is a whole host of other stuff that is also there. For example, finding disabled candidates can be really difficult for jobs. If you've got a quota and you want to employ people with a disability, they can be difficult to find. So that can sometimes require you to go above and beyond what you would normally do. That use of language that I was talking about goes double when it comes to disability. The fear of saying the wrong thing. I've trained people on customer service desks about the terms to use and the terms not to use, talking about disability. Most people are just really scared of saying the wrong thing. And actually, if they can get past that, they're a lot more natural. Barriers to progression are very big when it comes to people with disabilities in organizations who haven't given them the right tools to be able to thrive. And we'll come back to that. And disclosure rates, if a lot of disabilities are not visual, it wouldn't be obvious to somebody that you had a disability. My second in command in my team at the BBC decided to get himself checked out for dyslexia after we'd been working together for a couple of years. And yes, he was dyslexic. But the thing that inhibited him was, did he want to know that about himself? And did he want to share that even with me as an employer who really should know and understand these sorts of things? And it was a great moment for us as a team because he was much more able. He went from brilliant to super brilliant after that because we were actually able to give him tools that would help. And it's all of those tools, the complexities of access needs and all the rest of the stuff, which is the really kind of big challenge that most people who work in D&I have. It is challenging. It's challenging enough to think from, okay, I'm coming from an HR mindset, but I now need to think about facilities management for toilets and lifts and ramps and things. But I now also need to talk to my IT colleagues for reasonable adjustments, which could be technology, or it could be, it could be a bigger screen, or it could be a screen reader. And then I've got that sorted, but you're now saying that I need to get my procurement people on side as well to make sure that the tools we use actually work with those reasonable adjustments. And we need to do that across the whole customer journey. help. That's the sort of thing that we get from a lot of D&I people who are just, really not knowing where to go. The good news is that it's worth it. There's lots of really great research out there to say that companies that make efforts to hire people with disabilities see higher revenue than other companies. So 23%, according to Accenture. A lot of people with disabilities are great employees because they have skills, oftentimes because they have to work around aspects of a world that wasn't necessarily set up for them. They can think differently. The sort of thing we were talking about with the innovation can be really, really helpful. The other thing is that it is 2022, and so most organizations are trying to appeal to younger people who want to work for a company that has a purpose, that has the right sort of track record when it comes to inclusion and things like that. In this survey from Envision, they found that 53% of people who filled in the survey had their company get into accessibility in the last year because they wanted to be considered to be more inclusive. And that's generally how things are going. Everyone wants a purpose. That things like the UN Sustainable Goals are a really good way of an organization saying they're not just here to make money, they're actually here to sort of help the planet, as it were. D&I kind of comes out of that with all of those different types of characteristics. And obviously the media focus last year around Black Lives Matter was really helpful there. But the other great thing that's happening is the Valuable 500 are effectively putting a kind of a flag up to say people with disabilities need to be included in D&I, don't neglect them. And the great thing is that if you do recruit staff with disabilities, that's the best way of you getting good at accessibility. It's very, very difficult for you to say in a meeting, well, it doesn't really matter that our website or our app for customers isn't screen reader accessible. If you've got somebody who's blind in the room, that just doesn't happen. You wouldn't, you realize how crass that is. So it's really, really useful. The other thing is that we've got loads of really good case studies of where organizations have actually done inclusion really well for people who have actually acquired a disability whilst they were working there. This is Mark Webb. He's got multiple sclerosis and it got a lot more severe when he was at Dixon's Carphone. He's now an advocate for that company, talking about them and saying they were the best company to work for because they actually dealt with the change in his circumstance really well. So if you do this stuff, if you can get over this stuff, if you're in the D&I world, if you can work with your accessibility colleagues, then there are lots to win, but it needs people to work together. So Toby, that was my little trip through some of the things in D&I. Did I get them right? How could people know more?
Yeah, everything you said rings absolutely true. And a question that I get asked a lot is, how do we actually shift the dial on diversity and inclusion? Because some of the things that we do feel like they're very superficial, or they're just there to tick a box, or there's a bit of pink washing going on during, at the moment, LGBT month, for example, or Pride month, or that we're going to do something for international, the UN Day for the international, sorry, can't get my words out, International Day for Women for the UN, or the International Day of Disabled People in December. Or I talk to so many organizations who think in silos. So they're like, okay, we got an action plan on gender, we got another action plan on disability, and another action plan on race and ethnicity. But I had a really funny conversation with a colleague of mine who said, I'm a Black woman who has a disability, and there's 3 career development programs in my company. Which one do I go on? Surely we should have like one career development program that's inclusive, that helps lift everybody up. And so those questions got me thinking, and it's what led me to write my book, Inclusive Growth. Is what are those principles for embedding diversity and inclusion into an organization so that it is just part of the DNA? And I created the model on the screen, which I call the Inclusive Growth Framework, which has got 7 key principles. This is like an hour webinar in itself, so I can't go through it all. But essentially, the questions that we are asking in this model are, why is diversity and inclusion important to the growth of our business? How do we get our senior leaders walking the talk and setting the tone and the culture for the organization? How do we actually embed diversity and inclusion in a sustainable way through like a proper change management process. How do we create those inclusive employer journeys that we talked about earlier? What is the role of technology? How do we make our technology accessible? How can technology actually help us make a difference on D&I, giving us data, for example? How do we work as a whole organization rather than just this being the HR department's responsibility? And then finally, how do we authentically speak about D&I to the market in our own, authentic voice? So we're not coming across as being superficial or just saying the right words, but not having the right actions underneath that. And so those are the core principles that we should be thinking about.
Awesome, Toby. And as I say, there'll be some links at the end for you to be able to sort of contact with Toby to dive into any more of those that you want and get more detail. So last two sections before we have questions from folks. So Toby, this was one of the things you learned from me, baking accessibility into your product. Why is that so important?
Yeah, so when we worked together, Jonathan, I was your project manager, and obviously, project managers think about processes and stakeholders and methodologies and things like that. And I learned very quickly that accessibility had to be baked into the whole project from beginning and end. Like if you do testing at the end of your project, like you have completely missed the mark. Like that is the perfect recipe for delaying your project and blowing your budget out of the water. You have to have accessibility embedded right at the beginning when you're gathering your requirements and your designers are thinking about sort of prototyping and what your minimal viable product is like. But it's just, it goes beyond that development team as well, because you have to work with all of the other parts of the business. Marketing need to be thinking about how they make sure that your product, it's clear to the audience that your product is accessible and inclusive. It needs to be embedded in the business strategy. Your legal team need to be thinking about, if for example, we're outsourcing or contracting to other third-party suppliers like a web development agency, is it written into the terms and the conditions of the contract that that agency is going to be held to account for accessibility? So accessibility goes far and wide.
Cool. Yeah.
As I think this is just a reiteration from before, where we talk about how we get this into innovation.
Yeah, that's cool. And then just the last bit there.
Yep. And then there's a number of kind of tools and frameworks that can help you actually embed it into the organization. And obviously, Jonathan, you're really key at doing this. So, you've got ways of making sure that it gets embedded into the strategy and the policies and processes of the organization. There's you need to think about the technical side of things and how developers and testers and designers get it embedded into their development life cycle, the way that they work. But also rather handedly, the international standard has now been created, and that really does give a useful framework to make sure that you get it embedded into the business.
Too kind, Toby. As I say, that was something that I led the creation of, to try and sort of bring all of these things together. And I mean, one of those things, just to kind of reinforce that employee journey that we were talking about earlier, all of those different points where accessibility kind of fits within an organization. Let's say, Pete, if you or Hannah, if you could just put the link into the thing. But we did a whole webinar on this. I think it was November 2020, and there's a poster and a lot of videos about each of these 10 steps to try and make sure that accessibility is really working well internally. So one last bit before we get to how sort of working together is kind of, is helpful. One of the things that I really learned from Toby was actually some of the useful language in this area, or at least how to bridge between my language and sort of diversity and inclusion language. And that's helpful for a lot of accessibility people. So the last section is about something called intersectionality, which may or may not mean anything to you at the moment, but it's actually massively important for both D&I and accessibility. What do I mean? Well, if you think about, if you're from the accessibility world, most of the WCAG guidelines and all of the rest of the things that people talk about, they talk about the needs of people with a hearing impairment, captions, or, screen readers for people who are blind, all of these different things. And here's a graph of the prevalence of all of those in the UK. What they don't really talk about is this sort of stuff, which is that only 26% of people who have an impairment only have one of these. Actually, 53% of people who have an impairment actually have three. So to give a perfect example, my nephew Carl, which is the reason I got into accessibility in the first place, has a condition called spina bifida. That condition gives him three impairments. He uses a wheelchair, he's slightly autistic, and he has a slight learning difficulty. So these things come together. And there is this awful word that is used in the kind of literature called comorbidity for this term. I much prefer the word intersectionality, which is that actually people can have a number of different things at the same time applying to their life. So I rather like intersectionality rather than comorbidity. It sounds a lot better. And I wanted to kind of give you a few sort of examples of how this has kind of played out in our work. We were asked by the National Autistic Society to come up with some guidelines for digital accessibility for people who are autistic. And one of the really interesting things about autism is that it normally, like we were saying, doesn't come on its own. A lot of people who are autistic have dyslexia as well, or have a learning difficulty. So actually trying to work out those three different things and do some research into what people would need who had combinations of these impairments was really, really interesting. Another thing is, and this is the sort of stuff that made WCAG not want to do anything when it came to autism, was that people disagreed with each other. So they couldn't do guidelines because some people were really sensitive to colour, other people weren't. They were both autistic. Some people loved text, others hated it. They were all autistic. So we had to work out, if you like, these kind of categories within it, because we're talking about real human beings here. And similarly, a lot of people who are autistic, who are women, understand and get, if you like, diagnosed as autistic much later in life than men. And that can have an impact in how they understand their condition and how they work with it, which can also have an impact on the sorts of needs they might have for digital tools. So all of these sorts of things make up human beings, if you like, and all of them should be taken into account when you're trying to create things for people. So my point here would be, all of those benefits that Toby was talking about, that I was talking about, you can't get these if you think about impairments or about sort of like anything that doesn't recognize that people have got multiple things happening at the same time. I'll give you an example. The silver pound is worth £43 billion a year. So this is older people's spending power. And most of the time they're ignored by marketers, even though they've got more money than the rest of us, they're living longer and they want to be independent. So therefore they want to keep on serving themselves, maybe when they can't get out to the shops or branches of their stores the way they wanted, or hear calls on call centers. So actually online could be a really great way of enabling older people to actually have services that work well for them. And the research is that if you give them services like that, they're really, really loyal. But to win the custom of people like my mum, you need to understand that older people have got minor multiple impairments, so multiple things happening at the same time. My mum has dry eyes, so she finds it difficult to read. She doesn't have any difficulties with her hearing at the moment, but my mother-in-law does. My mum doesn't have any difficulties with tremors, but a lot of older people do. But my mum certainly has difficulty remembering things and actually understanding how to use computers in the first place. So to get a product that works for my mum, you can't just make something that works for people with a sight difficulty. You have to take all of the rest into account, or else you've done accessibility, but you've actually not, if you like, solved all of the problems, all of the challenges that my mum has. That's how you get real good stuff happening. And yeah, and when it comes to older people, we are talking about the workforce going forwards. You know, the 65 and older population will nearly double over the next 3 decades. So people will be working longer, you know, to much older. So you need to make sure that as those multiple minor impairments of aging come in, they can still do their jobs. They can still bring that wisdom, that experience they have, even if maybe they have some of these impairments going on. So that's a little bit of kind of intersectionality applied to my mum. Toby, you did a really great blog on LinkedIn a couple of months ago where it was about a disability event, and something about that event and intersectionality, if you like, didn't work. Can you give us a story on that?
Yeah, so I went along to an event a few weeks ago that was a disability related event, and the host of that event made homophobic slurs twice. So once upon my arrival in front of me, but another guy who was a gay guy himself, and he was actually one of the nominees of this particular awards. And then she made the same slur on stage in front of everyone else, which made me feel uncomfortable, but it made the other guy feel exceptionally devalued and uncomfortable, and he actually decided to leave the event early. And when I reached out to him afterwards to kind of see if he was okay and whether my experience kind of, you know, whether I was overthinking it at the time, he was like, no, absolutely, that kind of language, you know, mustn't be used, and it made him feel very uncomfortable and excluded. So I actually wrote an article about it, which created quite a lot of heat. I had a lot of support on LinkedIn from it, but essentially, you know, what we have to think that we have multiple identities, that when you're thinking about accessibility, you're not just thinking about those with disabilities or impairments, you're also thinking about other characteristics like age, gender, sexuality, you know, ethnicity, and how those combined characteristics shape our experience in the world.
Great, thanks, Toby. Yeah, I mean, that might seem a lot to get right, but that is what's needed. You know, it's not good, it's not okay to do inclusion in one way and maybe not others, even though it can be really challenging. So just a last question before we get some questions coming in. I know Pete's been doing a great job in the background on the chat of answering people's questions, but we'll save a few for the end. I wanted to just sort of bring this together into a bow and talk about what working together maybe looks like. Here's a couple of things that I've noticed that I think really need to change in this kind of intersection. So what I've seen is loads of D&I people writing commitments to say the valuable 500, and it's clear that they don't know very much about accessibility in terms of the stuff that's missing or the stuff that is given a level of prominence that it doesn't really need. So for example, you'll have statements that say building the skills and knowledge of our people so they can be disability confident and inclusive of people with disabilities. And yet, so it's all awareness training, but there is nothing in there about technical stuff like, you know, how to make sure a slide in a presentation deck is able to be viewed by all those people with disabilities. That's accessibility, so it's not our thing, as it were. You know, continuing to invest in workplace accessibility, rolling out our workplace adjustment services to more countries. That's great, but you give somebody a screen reader and you give somebody a tool that doesn't work with their screen reader. How have you helped? Further improving the accessibility of our advances or products for consumers. Oftentimes we see whole statements written on websites that don't talk about websites or digital at all and assume that accessibility is just about the physical world. So you need to bring people together to make those sorts of things work. Similarly, from the other side, you accessibility people out there, anyone written an accessibility statement? Yeah, did you reference your diversity and inclusion policies and commitments in it? If not, you are basically showing to the rest of the world that you are siloed. The accessibility people are here, the D&I people here, and the policies of these are completely different from each other. So that's the sort of thing where actually bringing in the D&I people and say, how do we work together and be holistic is a really good thing. How about you, Toby? I know there's some great stuff on your website. You know, how can accessibility people understand more about D&I?
it starts with kind of learning and education. So on my website, I've got an insights page, so mildon.co.uk/insights. On there, I've got my podcast where I interview D&I experts, including accessibility experts. So Jonathan is actually one of the interviewees of one of my podcasts. But, the last three, we've looked at how Nazia re-engineered recruitment process at the NHS. Fiona talked about inclusive leadership, and Kate talked about how employers should be supporting people with menopause in the workplace. So quite diverse set of interviews. And then also I've got my book, Inclusive Growth, which describes that framework that I went through earlier.
So that's good. So this is the Hassell inclusion way of doing things. So loads of principles there. How do you actually kind of like implement these into an organization? So this is something that you were talking with me about. Can you just give us like a 1-minute sort of intro to this, which I think is the inclusive growth flywheel? Is that right?
Yeah, I call it the flywheel because the previous framework, everyone loves it. They're like, oh my God, that's brilliant. There's 7 key principles there to really get it embedded into the organization. But how do we actually get it embedded into the organization? So I created the inclusive flywheel. And so first of all, we need to assess where your organization is currently at, get data, use that data to create your strategy, and then have a proper way of implementing it. And it's a flywheel because this is a continuous process. It's not something that you just do once. It's something that you have to just keep working at if you're serious about diversity and inclusion.
That's cool. Thanks, Toby. As I say, if you want more on that insights page and reach out to Toby. You can tell that we're both into processes because, and models and all of those sorts of things. So a couple from the accessibility side. From our perspective, all of that stuff about benefits was really sort of carefully considered for this one, because we still find that people don't have enough money. They don't know what to do to actually make this stuff happen within their organizations. We've got a buy-in toolkit on HiHub that you can use as completely free. And similarly, one of the reasons why we created our scorecards that anybody who comes to these would have heard a lot about over time is because what it does is it takes you out of that idea that accessibility is just your website, and it takes you throughout your organization so you can understand how well it's doing in all of these different places, including D&I, procurement, leadership, all of these different things. So we really encourage you to find your score on that, because it will take you on a really great journey. And as I say, we'll be happy to kind of help you on that. So any questions, Pete, for Toby and myself before we end?
So there was some interesting discussion around accessibility and whether you're going into the office or not. So there was a conversation in the group about, should you go in the office? How many people with neurodiverse experiences find working from home so much better and less stressful than going into the office? And there's one question from Wanda, which was, how do you stay current with all the accessibility apps and tools and tech out there? Because I think the slide showed a lot of different tools. Cool. So what's your view about staying up to date on that?
So actually, Toby, do you want to talk to the office one first, and then I'll round up with the techs?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot actually. So a lot of my clients are thinking about how they make return to work more inclusive, how the future way of working is more inclusive. They've realized actually, life has become easier for some disabled staff with the ability to work from home. So how can we have a hybrid way of working, but also making sure that even in a hybrid world, that we have that level playing field, that nobody's being left out of the loop, for instance. And some of that conversations are around, well, what technology do we need to adopt in the business to make sure that information flows freely? And then I go, that's great, pick the technology, but you also need to make sure that that technology is accessible. Because if somebody working from home has a disability and they can't use that technology, then they're not going to get access to that information.
Yeah, brilliant, Toby. And just in terms of keeping up to date with those technologies, these webinars are a good place to do it. If there's something new which is really, really interesting, it'll probably be on our webinars. Normally in January. So January, I do accessibility trends, which includes trends in, for example, the accessibility of different tools you might be using in the workplace, or new assistive technologies that are coming along to kind of help if there are, so that's a good way. We try and kind of put it all together for you so you don't need to kind of look everywhere. But if you do want to look everywhere, #A11Y is the place to be. That's where sort of Kate, our marketing manager, spends a reasonable amount of her time all of the time to try and pull out what's interesting and current. She's putting that out on our Hassell Inclusion Twitter channel. So good things there. I think we've got time for one more, Pete.
So I just wanted to add one more thing about the technology question. We know there's a lot of technology out there that have multiple customers. So if you are working with a reasonably major piece of software that's not accessible, get in touch with us. We would want to work with that organization to educate them and work with them. We're doing that already with a couple of global players in that space, and we're working with organizations where they're trying to get their suppliers accessible. So sometimes your organization may be too small to influence, but we or one of our other clients and partners may be able to push that to those people.
Absolutely. Together we do things well. We've got 1 minute left, so I think I need to move on to wrap up to what's coming next. So next month, you've seen me talk about it already. Our scorecard, it's a way of helping your whole organization understand what's going well and what isn't when it comes to digital accessibility. But some people have said, gosh, it's a bit difficult to fill in because I'm not totally sure what you mean by that question. So next month, if you've had any difficulty filling that in, or you'd like to understand, if you like, the thinking process and how all of these questions are designed to help you understand what you could do to get accessibility better throughout the organization, come along to our webinar next month. We're literally going to take you step by step through it and show you how answering a question in a particular way for your organization may save you loads of money or help you get in advance of the curve, or any of the sorts of things that you really might want in an accessibility plan. And the idea is, over the course of an hour, if you fill in the scorecard as you go with us, by the end of the hour, you'll have a draft accessibility plan if you've never had one before, or if you have one already, you'll have something to compare it against. So we're hoping that's going to be really, really helpful for people. We wanted to say thank you very much for your time today. As I say, we really appreciate it. Toby, any last sort of word from you?
My final word is, regardless of whether you're a D&I practitioner or an accessibility expert or practitioner, reach out to one another, because working together, you'll make a bigger impact in your organization.
Absolutely. Thank you, Toby. And if you want to reach out to either of us, you can get me at contact@hasselinclusion.com or Toby at mildon.co.uk. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. We're always trying to be the best hour of your month on how to really learn and go deep on accessibility stuff. If there's something you want to see in these webinars, if there's a question you've always wanted to ask, we do have in 2 months' time an Ask Me Anything. So you can ask there, or if you want us to spend a whole hour doing something, then let us know. As I say, just send us an email. But yeah, if you've liked this and you want more, go back to Eventbrite and sign up for the next of these webinars. We've got the next 3 that you can register for already. Thanks to Pete and to Toby. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks to all of you for your time. Enjoy your day, and together we can make accessibility happen. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.